Thank you for joining. We look forward to arming you with the necessary information so you can enable your organization and end users evolve to the next generation of login. Here's a brief summary of our agenda. We'll go through how login prompts have evolved to support more dynamic login processes, and also show you how you can enable users to migrate from a password to a passwordless experience with Auth0. Next, Ashish Jain will join me to discuss risks associated with passwords and also share on his experiences in rolling out passwordless to a broad user base. For legal reasons, please read this important note regarding forward-looking statements we may make during this presentation. I'm Brandon Simons. I'm the Director of Product for Okta Customer Identity Cloud. I'm joined today by Ashish Jain, who's the CTO of an Auth0 customer, Arcos Labs. Let's get started. Here's a prompt that I'm sure looks familiar to most of you. A straightforward set of input boxes to identify and validate a given user in one go. This prompt has served the web industry quite well. So well that many end users are very, very familiar with it. But unfortunately, many bad actors have become a little too familiar with the prompt as well, which leads us to a variety of security challenges, such as credential stuffing or potentially automation attacks against the prompt. Additionally, the login prompt is the front door to many interactions end users have when working with an organization. The dependency on a great web experience has grown rapidly. Most users find and connect with web organizations over the web today. For organizations, more connectors using their website and connecting over the web generally maps to more generated revenue. Now, with that, the evolution has occurred where it isn't just a single person or a single team within an organization that is concerned with how users are onboarded and log in and connect to their services and organization. Every part of the organization is now a stakeholder. Now, let's take a look at how the login prompt and experiences will be evolving to enable passwordless flows. Now, looking forward, we see a login prompt evolving from a single email and password prompt to authentication processes evolving to continue to get smarter to balance conversion and security. This doesn't mean that they'll get longer and require more clicks, but they'll be able to combine passive and active authentication factors in a very seamless manner. Now, by creating this layer of separation between the identification of a user and the factor to be verified, we are able to dynamically cater the authentication process for a user based on who they are and the context for which they're authenticating in. Let's take an example. You have a user signing in within a mobile native app. They may be more inclined to sign up with a phone number and an SMS delivered OTP, but that exact same person who's a user on a desktop machine may prefer to have the email provided and then sign up with an email delivered OTP, or maybe even a magic link. Now, this opens up a much wider range of authentication options that can be prompted to ensure that the highest security, while at the same time, the most seamless sign-on experience possible. At Okta, we see this progressing into flexible user journeys. Using no-code tools in combination to the rich extensibility points we are known for, you'll be able to create tailored experiences for sign-up, login, and account recovery. Nowadays, with more stakeholders involved, as the login prompt is often tied to revenue, remember, time to value becomes much more critical. With Auth0, you'll be able to easily build and configure your authentication flows. This will enable you to get up and running quite quickly and also tailor the experience just to your needs. Not only that, it'll allow you to quickly be able to respond to the needs of your end users quite rapidly. And with our login framework, for example, line of business could easily leverage funnel analytics to understand where traffic bottlenecks are occurring, and then be able to make the adjustments within your login flows. Security, it becomes easier to right size and get better in general by integrated passive and active authentication options. Additionally, security will be able to use our Security Center to help manage the risks associated with the org. Here are a few examples we can look at to enable a user could sign up and identify themselves with an email address or a phone number. And then the factor that is presented can be determined based on the way the user identifies themselves. Keep in mind, additional passive factors are also taken into consideration. And with this, we can identify a calculated risk based on the user, the context, and whether it's a known device for the given user. But making the transition to passwordless login experience can be a significant change for your end users. But let's take a look how you can use Auth0's progressive enrollment to enable users to migrate from a password to a passwordless login. Here we're in the Auth0's managed dashboard. We'll go to choose the authentication profile that allows us to use identifier first login. Here we have identifier plus password, identifier first, or identifier first with biometrics. And this enables our passwordless experience I want to show you today. We've configured our tenant to support passwordless. Now let's go to our app and show you what the sign up and the login experience looks like. First, we'll start up with the sign up. Here we'll go through, we'll provide our email address, go through, configure it. We'll identify ourselves with the same email. Click continue. We'll type in a password as we've been used to doing over several years. And here we're able to detect if the user's machine is capable of WebAuthn, and if so, we request them to log in and configure WebAuthn for this device. Simply with the scanning of a fingerprint, and they can go through and name the device. And after that, they have configured WebAuthn so that they can use a passwordless experience on this device. Now, let's go through logout. And here, we'll start over for what it would look like for a returning user coming to the same site. From sign in, we'll identify ourselves with our email address. We'll click continue. And here we won't be presented with a password. We'll simply be prompted to use the WebAuthn security key available on the local device. Scan our fingerprint, and we're logged in. Quite seamless. This enabled the user to use a password to initially sign up. They can revert to if needed, but pushing the user more into the experience of passwordless being secured with WebAuthn. Now, one of the bigger adoption challenges with WebAuthn to date has been that the credential has been locked to a single device. This meant that the seamless passwordless experience wouldn't be as easy for the end users to have multiple devices, a phone and a desktop computer. Nowadays, it's pretty common for users to have more than one device, connected to either Google, Microsoft, or Apple's iCloud. Now, with the addition of multi-device credentials for WebAuthn and passkeys, we are no longer have the limitation of a single credential being locked to a single device. End users can have their devices configured with one of the device manufacturers who will perform the credential syncing across devices. This is a big win for WebAuthn. It opens the doors for it to be much, much more widely adopted. Let's take a look at how this would work. Here's a snapshot which you can envision the login prompt looking today, but being enhanced with passkeys. Same prompt that you're familiar with. Simply select to type in your identifier. Here we're able to identify that there's a credential on the local machine for this given website. Now we simply select the credential. We go through, we scan our fingerprint to unlock the credential and to log in, and that's all it takes. We're able to log in after scanning, and you're able to access the given website or app. Now let's look at login on the linked mobile device. Now, imagine in this case, Apple would manage the synchronization of these WebAuthn protected keys across their ecosystem of devices. And now we'd be able to take advantage of that synchronization within our web login flows. And here, the user would be able to identify and verify themselves with the same identity across devices. First example being on a mobile or a desktop device. Here's on the mobile device. Now, this is a significant improvement as it enables secure and passwordless experience to be made easily available across all of this user's devices. But to learn more, let me welcome Ashish Jain to help us understand why all of this is so critical and how he sees this coming together in practice.
Thank you, Brandon. My name is Ashish Jain. I'm the CTO for Arcos Labs, and we are a bot detection, fraud management, and an account security company. Prior to joining Arcos, I used to lead identity, risk, and trust at eBay. And when I was at eBay, we had about 180 million active users. We operated in about 190 countries, and the charter of my team included all registration, authentication, account management, KYC, AML, all cancellation disputes and refunds, and a number of other things. So I got a pretty deep way to look into how a merchant looks at identity and fraud. And now in my current role and as a partner and a customer of Okta, I get to talk to a number of other customers in different verticals and understand how they are looking into identity and fraud. And I'm hoping to share some of those insights with you today. Now, Brandon talked about the end state of the passwordless journey and how the experience for an end user would look like. What I want to do in my part is just kind of walk you through some of the why or we should get to that spot, and then identify some of the steps that you need to take to get to that point. Now, what has happened in the last few years, especially in the pandemic time, is two primary kind of, I would say, changes. One of them is that most of the companies now have an online presence. There is definitely a significant amount of new focus on online applications and services. And the second thing is that now we are seeing a lot more users who are accessing the internet the first time. Both of those have resulted into a lot more scenario into what, from a fraudster standpoint, a much better ROI. And then the total number of attack vectors that we see on the sites that we are protecting has gone significantly high. You may not realize it, but then, 1 in every 5 login attempt across the industry on the login page is actually an account takeover attempt where a fraudsters would try to take access and hold of the account of a good user. Similarly, there's a report which Okta published about 2 months ago, where 30% of the new accounts created are actually fake accounts or fake registrations. And we have seen across our customer base that number increase about 85% year over year. The third interesting metrics to know about is just the amount of malicious traffic across the industry. That number is around 35 to 40%, which is basically the number of just bots trying to attack either credential stuffing or ATO attempts. And at peak time, for instance, day after Thanksgiving or Christmas for e-commerce retailers and all that, that number goes to almost 75%. So even if they are not successful in doing the account takeover, those attacks on your website are still taking your site speed, your compute resources, and you end up paying for it. So this is the problem that we see across the industry from all online services. And when I get to talk to a number of customers, I can almost look at that as an identity team and as a risk and a fraud team. The focus most of the time for the identity team is to be able to reduce the friction for good users. So for instance, if you ask them, hey, can you implement MFA? And the answer would be that it will impact the adoption rate for the good users. If you think about it, the metrics that they measure would be sign-in completion rate. How many people came to the login screen? How many people were able to complete the login screen? Similarly, the registration rate of people who showed up and people who ended up making an account. The moment you increase those kind of security measures, whether it is enforcement of 2FA, sometimes it is, can I increase the password length from 8 to 12 characters and add a combination of alphanumeric and characters, all of that end up increasing. And generally SMS or email verification at about 15 to 20% of the abandonment rate. So there is a pushback from the identity team because the numbers that they are measuring negatively impact the more friction that you put in front of the good users. Now, if you talk to the risk and fraud team, the metrics that they measure are slightly different. They are looking for losses, they're looking for chargebacks, account takeovers, cancellations, and disputes. So if you ask them that should we implement 2FA, they are definitely favor of it because that means raising the defenses for the bad users. And as it turns out, right, when you have a new user coming to your site, the first page that he will interact would be registration or login, and the third one is account recovery. The three most attacked pages by fraudsters on any website are registration, login, and account recovery. So then it comes down to you have the same three endpoints, two different entities with the two different success criteria or the measures that they're looking for. And I think that's where sometimes it creates the dilemma of what is the right balance and how do I kind of go about implementing what's the right solution for the end customer without putting the system or the business into a risk. Now, talking about the risk, there are the different types of attack vectors that we are seeing in the industry today. I'm not going to go through all of them in the interest of time. I'm sure you have heard of phishing and wishing, SIM swapping and all that. The point I would like to highlight is what has changed in the last few years. What we are seeing is that the attacks have remained the same, but the amount of sophistication and automation have gone significantly up. An example of that, I'm sure you know the example of a phishing where if somebody has access to your username and a password, and if your account is protected by SMS, what they would end up doing, they will call the end user. They're going to say, I'm calling from the bank and then there is some problem with your account. I'm going to send you a message. Please read that to me on your phone. And then they log in on your behalf on the username and a password on the bank website. Then the bank triggers an SMS. They ask you to read it to them. They enter it and now they have access. Now, the problem in this way is that the fraudsters would have to call. If they make 10 calls, 2 of them are successful. It takes time and effort. At the end of the day, it is a business for fraudsters. Now, what has happened is that all of this, what I described, can now be automated. A new bot came out into the market about a year ago called SMS Ranger, which can essentially automate the whole process of phishing, claimed about 86% efficacy. And I think once you have access to those tools, fraudsters, the moment they have a username and a password access, can essentially just launch a big campaign to attack the end users. Similarly, when I talk about the barrier to entry has gone lower, there is other tools you may have heard of. The one of them is called as Sentry MBA. Other one is called as Open Bullet. And the way these tools operate is that they're free, by the way, open source. You can download it. There's a strong community behind it. There's tons of YouTube tutorial which tells you exactly how to use them. You get a username and a password list. You can, if you have contacts, you can get them from the dark web. If not, you can just search for combo list on Pastebin, and you just apply that to the tool, and then you get a million username and a password combo list. You apply, you get 1% success. That's essentially your jackpot. And this is as easy as it has become. In the same context, just the sophistication of those tools. There's a new one that we have been playing around. It's called Genesis Marketplace. And generally what happens is that most businesses have some kind of a device binding. So if you go to Google and if you try to access Google from a brand new laptop or a mobile device, they will tell you, look, I have not seen this device. I need you to do an extra authentication. Some other websites like Netflix, they will let you log in, but they're going to send you an email afterward that I'm seeing a new activity from a device I have not seen before. So generally, there is some kind of a device check that most websites end up doing today. The Genesis Marketplace, what it does is that it installs a plugin or a malware on the devices. It hijacks the cookies. And then when you have a username and a password combination, it combines them together. So it gets your user agent, it gets your browser, it gets your patches. And then they sell the whole thing as a package. And they also have a built-in browser so that they can replay it and the sites cannot detect that it's coming from a brand new device. The other major fraudsters tool that we came across was called Evil Proxy. I'm guessing you all heard of it. It came about again 2 months ago, and it was a reverse proxy man-in-the-middle attack where you can subscribe to it. It's about $400 per month, so not exactly cheap. But then they have built-in templates and campaigns for majority of the sites, including Google, Microsoft, Dropbox, and a number of others. And the point I'm trying to make by bringing up these issues is that the barrier to entry for fraudsters to attack your website has gone down. At the same time, the sophistication for many of them to bypass the defenses of the websites have gone up. And something is that you are dealing with every day, and then you have to kind of keep that in mind, which kind of brings it back to how do I avoid this? What can I do? What are the different methods I should be able to use? Now, before I talk about the methods, I want to kind of share some of the framework that you should have in mind. Now, we talk about any time you pick an authentication solution, you have to kind of evaluate from the lens of usability, security, and then the third one I bring up is maintainability. For a large website, if you think bringing up a solution, authentication solution to your end users is hard, try rolling it back, because changing the behavior is hard. And once you have done that, the people do not want anything to be taken away. And I have a number of examples where we rolled out a solution. There was some pushback of why you did it, because we were asking people to change their behaviors. But the moment we said, I have something better, I'm going to deprecate it, there was a huge outcry in the community of why we are taking it away. So you have to kind of keep that in mind before you roll out anything else for your customer base. The other point to take into account, you're going to at least touch 3 flows the moment you introduce a login, an authentication solution: your registration or onboarding or enrollment flow, your login flow. And I know that many companies have more than one login flow, across different places of web and also on mobile and other platforms. And the third flow that you should keep into account is the account recovery. Once the user has lost their credentials, what does that flow look like? Now, here's a list of authentication methods that I have rolled out in the past across my experience. And either I rolled them from scratch or did a significant rehaul. So I have a fairly detailed data in terms of both their adoption rates, the challenges I had with each one of them, the time and effort it took to roll them out. One thing I would like to highlight is that not one of them is what I would call a silver bullet. There are benefits, pros and cons for each one of them. An example of that would be like email verification. Of all the things, it is probably the cheapest to implement, where you send a code to an email or potentially a magic link. The challenge, of course, would be that the user would have to do a context switch to go to a different browser or a different app into the on a mobile device. And most of the time, end users may end up using the same password both for your website and the email. So security-wise, sometimes it doesn't provide you the best option. Phone-based SMS, very, very popular. If you take a survey across the industry, my guess would be that of the B2C websites, the 2FA adoption is somewhere between, with less than 10% for sure. And of that adoption, about 60 to 70% is SMS. It has worked out pretty well. Having said that, it is expensive. US, it is really penny SMS. If you go to Europe and Asian countries, that's where you have business. It's much more expensive. And then we have seen tools like Evil Proxy, other one is Caffeine and SMS Ranger, where we know that there are ways to bypass it. The third thing around SMS to keep in mind is something called IRSF fraud, which is International Revenue Share Fraud, where the fraudsters collude with the telcos so that there are 800 numbers that the fraudsters would enter into your website. You will trigger an SMS. You may end up paying up to 50 cents per call. So that bill will get significantly higher if this is your only 2FA or authentication solution. Other one which is very popular, we have launched, is called push notification, where you send a notification, you click on approve and deny. Again, cheaper to implement. You can do that in-house. A great experience. User does not have to type anything. At the same time, you are limited only to the users who have your application, so they have to download the app. Most websites, I would say, still are about 50 to 60% adoption of the application download. So you have to take into account that part. FIDO sponsored web authent has been a great addition to this kind of set of tools that you should have. We launched it across our customer base at eBay, and overall, I would say that the completion rate was equal or better than password. Even on mobile devices were even better. The time to log in, the user comes in, enter credential, whether they are biometric or password, was of course much better. The challenge, of course, comes in, which is sometimes, I think Brandon mentioned that earlier, around device binding, and that's where sometimes context becomes important. If you are accessing a site, let's just say Netflix or Instagram, where you're logging them on a daily basis, that's kind of one context. If you're trying to log in, let's just say on Expedia and Airbnb, where you book travel once a quarter, that's the other context. If you're trying to access your taxes, TurboTax, TaxPro, any of that, you log in once a year, you have to take that into account, because in US, for that matter, 30% people end up changing their devices into an year. So if you have strong device binding, 30% of people, and WebAuthn is the only way you support, 30% of people would have to enroll every single time they're logging into your website, and that is a challenge. Now, passkeys solve that problem because there is not really a strong device binding. It creates some additional issues that I'll touch upon in a second. The message I'm trying to give in this site is that there are multiple ways to get around password as authentication methods. You have to take into account your context. People are logging in daily versus annually. You have to take into account your audience and your user base. The typical audience for a site like, let's just say, Roblox is very different than the typical user for a banking website. And their ability to change and adopt is also very different. So that heterogeneity and diversity of your user population should be a factor of which authentication method that you should push for. The question then comes in, hey, look, okay, this makes sense. How about we talk about how do we get there, some interim milestones. Now, before I talk about the interim milestones of the authentication, I want to touch a little bit on the concept of passive authentication. And I'm not exactly sure if this is an industry term. I use it to be able to describe where, in my mind, active authentication is where the user will have to take certain action to be able to prove they are the same person who was there the last time. Passive authentication tell me a little bit more about the user without having any active interaction from the end user. And there are a number of ways that I can get that signals or data. An example of that would be IP. Anytime a user would come to my website to log in, I get to know what IP they're coming from. I get to know whether or not they're coming from a VPN, they're coming from a data center, they're coming from a Tor node. All of them are signals which can feed into my risk-based decision. Brandon also touched upon that earlier. For instance, if you're coming from a VPN, that's not really a bad thing, but combined with other signals, that may be a risk. Similarly, if you're coming from a data center and I see about 100 requests coming in from the same data center, that should trigger a velocity check for me that why is so many people logging into my Netflix account, as an example, from a data center. Same thing goes for email, right? I can figure out if somebody's trying to make a new account, was this email created 2 days ago? Is there any kind of email tumbling involved? Email tumbling is when, for instance, if you have a Google account, you can add a dot, you can add a plus, and you can create n number of same Google account with the same email address. So is that involved? Email enumeration, when I see something like Ashish 1, Ashish 2, Ashish 3, so I can know that with the script behind the scene. Sometimes it is the email address, all the letters on the keyboard next to each other, which makes me feel somebody just entered randomly to be able to make an account. All of them are passive signals I can use to be able to detect or get some sense whether or not this is the real user. Same thing goes for phone. Is this a voice over IP phone? Is this prepaid or postpaid paid phone? The address on the phone number, is this the same address that I have on file for the end user? So for instance, this is very recent that the Twitter, you can get the blue for $8. They do not allow voice over IP phone. That is an example where that part of the verification that you see a lot more fraud for voice over IP or prepaid phones. So all of those signals I can leverage to provide a much better secure experience. On the same thought, device fingerprinting. Every time you log in, I get to pick up certain signals from the device, and I can then include if there is a spoofing happening. Like many times what fraudsters do to bypass the velocity checks that almost every site has these days is create random signatures. And you can then detect it. For instance, if this is an iOS phone, the screen size does not make sense. For this Android version, this font is not available. So you can capture those signals and then feed into your engine to be able to ask for additional authentication or reject the request. Same thing goes for behavior biometrics, the touch, gestures, how do you hold the phone, mouse movements, all of them can give you a signal. If it is a bot, there is no mouse movement. For instance, sometimes you see a very precise replay over and over, and that gives you an idea that this is again a script. So there are a variety of those signals that you can use to augment your strategy, and there are a number of vendors and customers and open source solutions for you to be able to address that. Now, coming back to how you roll out, there are a few things I want to highlight. We talked about in the Brandon said the screen where you decouple the credential into two parts. One of them is the identifier, which is you can use for discovery, and the other one is the actual credential. It is critical for you to be able to do that. Now, one thing to keep in mind that the very first time you do it, you potentially may see a drop in your completion rate, because historically, if you see legacy websites will have same screen, enter my username and a password, you split them into screens just by itself, that may result into a little bit drop, especially because every user would have to go through this brand new experience. Now remember, once you do that one time and you're able to remember the identifier, the second time around, the user will not have to enter the identifier. So that conversion rate would eventually get better, but be prepared that that number may go down to begin with. I touched upon passive authentication. This is something that you need to augment as part of your overall strategy. And then in my opinion, that you would need some kind of a backup and recovery, and email and phone and push are great recovery methods that you should keep in mind. And if you combine them with a strong device binding, they give you the 2FA that you're looking for. Social sign-in, something that depending upon your business, login with Google, login with Facebook provides something similar where you can outsource your authentication registration to Google, and then you can have some downstream flows where even if you outsource registration, you can still ask your users to be able to create credentials on your site. I want to touch upon account settings. The moment you are implementing all of those solutions, keep in mind that it is a new behavior for your end users. So they're going to have to think about it. And if they get confused, they're going to end up calling your customer service. So investing into account settings, whether you build it yourself or use the Auth0 out of the box account settings page, but you want to provide much more flexibility and intuitive experience where the end users can pick authentication methods and the recovery flows. Otherwise, each one of them going to end up increasing your overall cost for the company. Then comes to WebAuthn and passkeys. Like I said, of all the things I have seen so far, this is a very, very strong solution which has the right balance in between security and experience. The only thing I would caution to keep in mind is this is the new experience. The platform support is still coming. There are still some nuances. So when you roll it out, for that matter, you kind of have to take a little bit of a gradual approach. An example of when we rolled out, we did on a platform by platform basis. And we had this logic we call snooze logic, where I think Brandon showed the flow where you log in. I'm going to show you a pop-up where you just have one click and you can enroll. However, not every user would want to enroll. And there is this fine line in between nudging a user versus annoying a user. And you have to kind of keep that in mind. So what, for instance, we did is we will show the pop-up 2 times in a row. And if the user decides not to enroll, then we will pause for 6 months and then show the user one more time. I think that's something that you have to kind of play around so that you're able to nudge the users in the right direction. And the change of behavior, especially as passkeys and WebAuthn gets implemented across the website, become more popular, users will get more and more comfortable enrolling into that concept. So I think, overall, like I said, if I recap it, I want to highlight one more time the amount of fraud that we are seeing is going through the roof. I think in 2022, it was about 43 billion in consumer fraud. There are a number of passwordless methods that you should think about, and not one answer, depending upon the vertical, depending upon the state of your company, depending upon what is the metrics your company cares more for. Is that user growth or is that risk losses? Find that right balance. There's a sequence of steps that you have to go through. It will be great if you have right monitoring and measurement for each step across the way, so that you can convince your management that this is the right direction. And at the end, I'm going to still say that there is don't have to wait. There is plenty of technical solutions available today, and then your answer would be a combination of them, passkey being the leading one. You don't have to wait any longer, and my recommendation would be to kind of get started as soon as you can. On that note, I want to thank you for joining in today. I hope you found this session useful. If you have any follow-up questions or comments or feedback, please reach out to Brandon or me. And again, thank you for your time.